Good morning to you and welcome to Penn Vicarage on this Monday morning. Hope you've had a lovely weekend, and may I say thank you very much indeed for being with us for our Bible talk for today as we continue our adventure through the incredible book of Genesis. And today we're in chapter 15 and we are picking up the story of Abram, who of course we know in 3 chapters becomes Abraham. So it's Abram at this stage. So without further ado, Genesis chapter 15. Genesis 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You give me no offspring, and a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you're able to count them. And he said to him, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of Chaldeans, to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought him all these and cut them in two, laying each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in two. When the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that's not theirs, and shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river of Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, Abram. I think the story of Abram is an absolutely fascinating one because it's really, I think, mostly anything, a study of faith. Okay, Abraham was, by all accounts, a towering man of faith. He was a tremendously faithful guy, and who believed God, and had God promised him, and Abraham believed him, and so on and so on and so on. But if you get to know the narrative here and get to know the narrative of the whole story of Abraham, you see that it's actually a bit more complicated than that. Yes, he did have incredible faith, but it was actually his faith was something of a journey. And sometimes he showed great faith, and actually sometimes he showed very little faith as well. So I think we need to acknowledge that for some people, we tend to think of people either as people who have faith and people that don't. And I think what's clear from this is that it's a lot more complicated than that. And that in our own lives, there can be parts of our lives when we can have tremendous faith, and there are parts of our lives when we struggle to have faith. And there are parts of our life when we believe God and trust God, and it comes easier to us. And there are parts of our lives when it's quite difficult to trust God as well. I think it's right that we acknowledge that, and that's certainly the case with Abram. In chapter 12, God called Abraham to uproot everything and go off and go where God said. And Abram had tremendous faith, and he did what God said. And God made tremendous promises that he'd make him the father of a great nation, and he'd give him land to possess and so on. And Abraham believed him, and that's great. I mean, Abraham didn't just believe God, but he put faith into action. He went when God told him to do, and he was great. So in chapter 12, Abraham shows huge faith. Then in chapter 13, he goes to Egypt, and actually shows, I think, very little faith. Actually, he's certainly not great. Wasn't a great husband in chapter 13. He doesn't, and he uses trickery in chapter 13 to kind of protect himself. Then in chapter 14, as we happened on Friday, we have this tremendous situation where there's these two battles between the four kings and the 5 kings around Sodom, and his nephew Lot gets taken away. And Abraham kind of gets together with a few local friends and forms a small army and to rescue Lot. And he not only manages to do so, but actually gives quite a good victory as well. And so he shows great kind of faith then. And here at the beginning of 15, we have Abraham kind of receiving the fallout from this. You can imagine how Abraham must have felt after having, being done what God said, that he's had these Israel in Egypt, and now he's had this business with he's kind of escaped by the skin of his teeth, thank God's strength. And he must be cool. Whoa, you kind of imagine what's going on in his mind. And then here at the beginning of chapter 15, we have God appearing to Abraham. And let's not forget also that Abraham has been promised the descendants, but also the father of the nation, and also the land. And he hasn't received either of those yet. And so you can kind of see where you can put yourself into Abraham's shoes. You're reeling from this battle in chapter 14. You're having these promises, but the promises haven't been fulfilled yet. But interestingly, God appears to him just at the time when God needed to. And in my experience, actually, when God calls you to something, God gives you the calling that you need at the right time. And God calls to Abraham now after what's happened. And the first thing God says is, do not be afraid. The thing which God says more than anything else in the whole Bible is, do not be afraid. And then Abraham kind of lays out the situation before God. And he talks about, look, I haven't got descendants yet. The guy that's going to inherit my stuff as he goes, he's not a relative, he's one of my slaves, Eleazar. And he kind of lays out the situation. And I think it's right, actually, that we are honest and straight with God. We just recently have done a series on the Psalms, which is certainly a situation when the guy that wrote the Psalms was very, very honest with God. And it's not faithless, it's actually faithful to be honest and straight with God about what's kind of the situation and what's going on. And then, of course, God says to Abraham, this will happen. And in this wonderful verse, in verse 6, Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. So he got this frightened guy. God tells him, reminds him, he tells God the situation. God tells him it's going to happen. And Abraham believed God. And that's tremendous. And it's in the New Testament as well, that Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. That actually it's something it tells us, that however tough it may be, our job as Christians is to believe God and to trust God. And that's what faith is. And to recognize from this reading that faith is an up and down thing, that sometimes God feels very close and sometimes God doesn't, but we still believe. And that sometimes, that, as I say, the faith is a journey, and it certainly was a journey for Abraham. He was reading from this battle. God appears to him. He tells him not to be afraid. Abraham lays out the situation that he hasn't got a family yet, and blah, 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 blah. And God tells him it's going to happen. And Abraham believed him. And that's what we need to do, my friends, is like Abraham, to believe God and to trust God. And that's what Abraham does. And to make the point, God creates this covenant with Abraham. Abraham makes this offering, gets his animals and cuts them in two, and then protects them from the wild birds, so because he's offering it to God. And then God gives him this dream, this remarkable dream, and then he kind of wakes up, and then this fiery pot goes between in the middle of the offering. And I think that's God's way of saying, yes, this is it. I'm confirmed this is going to happen. And he kind of promises to Abraham that you will be a great nation, you will receive, you will, and this is what will happen to your children, and so on to come. They will have trouble, you will be fine, they'll have trouble, but I will rescue them. And he kind of unpacks, if you like, some of the future that's going to happen to Abraham's children and so on. But at the end, Abraham believes him. But I think what I want you to see from this is the kind of journey of faith that Abraham goes on. Abraham was a great man of faith. He believed God, but he had times when he had areas of his life when he wasn't so good at it. He had times of his life when believing God was not easy. But the incredible thing about Abraham is he does believe God, and God reckons it to him as righteousness. And my friends, I suppose I want to say the same thing to us today, that actually faith is a journey. Sometimes faith seems easy, and sometimes it doesn't. And as I said before, there are parts of our lives when we can trust God easily, but there are parts of our lives when it can be a struggle sometimes. And when God delays responding, I mean, God had promised 2 or 3 chapters ago that you would give him the nation and everything else. God's delay is not the same as God's no. And sometimes God teaches us patience. Sometimes we have to be patient. So faith is a journey. Faith is an adventure. Faith goes up and faith goes down in our lives as it does. But in the end, Abram believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Friends, keep the faith. Keep believing, keep trusting. It's a challenge at times, but that's what Abraham did. That's what we need to do. Let's know in our hearts and minds, and may you know in your heart and mind today the goodness of God with you, and may we all have the courage today to trust him in all things. Hope that makes sense. God bless you. Have a lovely day. Thanks for watching. Do share these messages with